Resident Evil. It's one of survival horror's all-time classic series. Some would even claim it as the proprietor of survival horror. The series is a long-standing franchise filled with a range of experience and terrors that I personally have been a fan of for a long time. See, I was just a kid when I was first introduced to the franchise, and honestly, I was scared of most horror games back then. But I had this friend that really loved it and wanted to share it with me. He loaded up a save file, and suddenly I was in this massive boss fight, battling the Elegante. I just remember thinking it was the coolest thing ever. I didn't really understand the depth to the game or the overarching storyline, and although my first interaction with the game was brief, it stuck with me forever. It was fresh, a different kind of game for me, and man, I was hooked. Fast forward 15 years, and now I've just finished 100%ing its most recent outing, Resident Evil Requiem. There's just something so surreal about these games that keeps me coming back for more. From your first encounter with a zombie, to battling giants like the El Gigante, to running for your life in tight corridors while being chased by massive mutated spiders. It's an experience from start to finish. This series is filled to the brim with genre-defining moments, well-crafted stories, and a whole host of scares and insane moments. You know them, I know them, and today, I'm ranking them. From the game that started it all, Resident Evil 1, to the series' most recent outing, Requiem. I'll be taking the time to rank every mainline entry in the series based off my own personal enjoyment. Now, to clarify what I mean by mainline entries, today we'll be covering Resident Evils 1 through 9, including the remakes, Revelations 1 and 2, and finally, Code Veronica X. So strap in, ladies, gentlemen, and all of those of you that are in between, because without further ado, we're starting with where it all began.
Resident Evil.
Honestly, and I'm sure you've all heard this before, but seriously guys, what can I genuinely say about this game that hasn't already been said? Resident Evil 1 started it all. Tank controls? We got it. Fixed camera angles? Yep, we got it. Unimaginable horrors beyond mankind? Did you say we got it? Because, yeah, we got it. Seriously, dude, like where do you even begin? From the first moments you load up the game and enter Spencer Mansion, you are experiencing what Resident Evil truly is at its core, a survival horror masterpiece. No game, besides maybe Silent Hill itself, sets up a better atmosphere than the first time you load up Resident Evil. Beyond just the looks and feel of the game itself, this is our first time meeting series staples like Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, Wesker, Rebecca Chambers? Yeah, they're all here, and it all started from this first game. I find myself playing Jill most times, honestly. See, I don't much care for a lot of backtracking, which go figure, Resident Evil and backtracking, right? But starting with a lockpick and 2 inventory slots was a no-brainer. It's really what sold it for me. Matter of fact, while we're on the subject, that is one thing that can be a bit of a pain. Like, playing as Chris is almost like a slightly harder difficulty. See, he starts with 2 less inventory slots, and on top of that, one of the slots for the first 35 to 40% of the game is being taken up with the key that you need to open up other doors. It's not a bad thing, honestly. The difference between the 2 characters makes sense gameplay-wise. I just tend to enjoy playing Jill more often. Man, though, does this game ever do enemies right. For the first half of the game, you're really only ever going to experience the zombies and maybe a zombie dog or 2, nothing crazy. But once you step foot out that mansion, the game does a great job of picking up the pace and making sure that you're not really ever comfortable with where you're at. Start throwing spiders and hunters at you, some of the series' staples, and oh god, if you're playing the remaster, Lisa Trevor and the Crimson Heads would love to say hello. Sounds like a band name, doesn't it? Speaking of the remaster, you'll notice that all of the footage playing has been from the remaster, and that's because there really isn't a lot of difference between the 2 games. Everything from the original Resident Evil is included in the remaster, and even more has been added, such as the creatures that we touched on just a little bit ago. So I decided to lump them together in this ranking. All in all, though, I cannot possibly think of too much more to say about this game. It's probably the easiest out of all of them to rank. Did you ever have any doubt? Yeah, it's S tier.
Resident Evil 0.
You've been through the horrors that took place at Spencer Mansion, but what about the events that took place that led you there? That's where Resident Evil 0 comes into play. A prequel focusing on what happened to the STARS Bravo team and Rebecca's journey in the Arklay Mountains. Taking place just before the events of Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 0 suffers from prequelitis, lacking any sort of tension and suspense, leaving a lot of its attempts at storytelling to fall flat, since players of the original game already know the outcome of everything that happens here today. Luckily for 0, it's the journey that counts, not the destination. Or so they say. This can be good at times. Take the train section of the game, for instance. What better survival horror location than a tight, claustrophobic nest of train cars that really leaves you questioning every decision you ever make? Should I leave this healing item behind and take more ammo and try to squeeze through the next car filled with zombies? Or do I save my precious weapon resources and try to slip past the zombies so that I'm prepared more in the future? I feel like no other section in any Resident Evil game handles these survival horror dilemmas better than Resident Evil 0 and its train section. New to Resident Evil, you now have the ability to play as two characters at the same time. Along your adventures in the train, you'll meet convict Billy Cohen, a soldier who went AWOL and was being transported to his sentenced death when everything all went down. Now he's in the same position as you, just trying to get out of this mess alive. While playing the game, Rebecca and Billy have to work together in many segments to help each other progress. Sometimes, the game does this well, like in the train section. At a certain point, both main characters get split up and have to pass key items through a service lift, which is a neat idea to ease players into the new partner system. However, this is one of the few examples of the game actually utilizing this system. Unfortunately, they don't touch on it very often, so much so that while writing this script, I can only remember one other instance of working together with Billy to solve a puzzle, which happens much later in the training facility, where Billy's too big to fit through an opening in the wall, so you have to lift up Rebecca into the hole, which, to be honest with you, felt kind of lame. It's sad to see such an interesting idea never really get fleshed out throughout the course of the game, especially when it's a main selling point. Unfortunately, 0 is a prime case of the old saying, taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. While they make fun improvements to the game, a lot of the game's sections suffer from series fatigue. At the time, Resident Evil had been releasing games for 6 years. There was only so much that you could do with the same formula, and 0 being one of the last tank control fixed camera angle titles, ended up eating the brunt of that fatigue. Most of the game's bosses barely even fight you back. Those familiar will remember completing the training facility just to get to the big centipede-like boss Centurion, who literally just walks around the arena. If you're lucky, he might attempt attacking you. All that work and you don't even get a cool boss. But it doesn't just end at the lame bosses. The game is filled with frustrating enemy types. Having no space to improve on enemies just meant making the enemies unfun and needlessly difficult to fight. The Eliminators come to mind. Mutated monkey-like enemies that will absolutely drive you insane when you're battling the tank controls and trying to hit them while they're flying off at Mach Jesus speed and bouncing around whatever room you encounter them in. And don't get me started on the waste of space that is the Toad enemies. Oh yeah, and did you want needlessly tanky enemies too? Well, we got leech monsters. What's so cool about them? Nothing. They just simply block the hallways, waste all your gear, and make you not want to play anymore. All of this combined in the damn removal of the item box system, making it to where if you want to swap items in your inventory, you have to then drop them on the ground and remember where you left them, only to then backtrack and pick them up later when needed. In the train section, it's not that big of an issue, because it's a very small and tight-knit area. But that's only the first 15% of the game. The rest, however, takes place in the training facility, which is massive. So you'll end up dropping an item, then spending 20 minutes running back later just to pick it up, open a door, drop it, and do the same thing all over again. While I love what Zero does right, I cannot deny that it can be extremely frustrating to get through. When it's good, it's pretty damn good. But man, when it's bad, I just don't want to play anymore. And for that reason, I'm giving it a ranking of C.
Resident Evil 2.
Up till now, you've only had to deal with minor outbreaks in secluded areas, unbeknownst to the world. But what happens when all hell breaks loose and the massive city you reside in is exposed to horrors which were once kept behind closed doors? Releasing in 1998, Resident Evil 2 follows the unfortunate first day of rookie cop Leon S. Kennedy and fellow survivor Claire Redfield. Wait a minute, Redfield? Does that mean... Yes, you heard correctly. One of the main characters from the first Resident Evil game, Chris Redfield, has a sister, and she's the primary protagonist in Resident Evil 2, where she's on the hunt to find Chris after his disappearance since the Spencer Mansion incident from the first game. These two everyday, ordinary individuals find themselves trapped in the horrors of Raccoon City, just as everything starts to go awry. With no one else to trust but themselves, they have to work together to find out what's going on and get the hell out of Raccoon City. Resident Evil 2 is where the series really starts to hit its first stride. We're no longer limited to that isolated mansion in a tiny underground lab. Beyond that, Resident Evil 2 takes massive steps to really make the game feel more grandiose, which the player can feel immediately from the first time they step foot into the RPD. The scale of the game is massively improved from where we began. New to the series at this point, the game also starts experimenting with an interwoven story with 2 scenarios for each character, any of which, when you play them, will have outcomes and effects that are determined through your own actions during your playthroughs, which will impact the plot of the overarching story and what the player can interact with throughout the game. Take, for instance, if you were to kill the alligator during the sewer chase sequence as Claire in your first scenario, when you reach that point as Leon, Claire would have already killed the alligator, leaving Leon safe and sound to traverse the area without having to worry about a giant monster chasing him down. But the game doesn't just stop experimenting there. They decided to go the extra mile and introduce players to a whole new level of fear. During one of the player's chosen scenarios, a brand new mechanic is introduced. That's right, stalker enemies. Most people seem to think it started with Resident Evil 3 and Nemesis. However, we'll touch on that later, but the truth of it all is, it started back in Resident Evil 2. With the game introducing Tyrant 00, or as fans of the series like to call him, Mr. X, a massive hulking enemy who throughout many sections in the game will appear to the player as a wall standing in between them and progress. During these segments, it's up to the player to make a choice. Should you spend your precious resources and knock him down so that you can by unharm? Or should you risk eating a couple hits to sneak past him and live to use your resources on more pressing matters? While this is a cool concept and neat at first, you'll soon realize that it's not really as opposing as you might think. See, when Tyrant shows up, although for new players it might not be entirely obvious at all you have to do is make it one room apart from him and he'll just leave you alone afterwards. Until the next time he shows up to get in your way. While not the most advanced iteration of stalker enemies, for a first go, it sure left its mark on players and led to new iterations of the concept down the line. And while we're at it talking about new enemies, perhaps the series' most iconic enemy is introduced in this title, and I think a lot of you know what I'm getting at. That's right, the Lickers. To this day, I don't think a single enemy has come along in franchise history that has instilled as much fear and terror as this wall-crawling, heavy-breathing, skinless monstrosity. When you step into the West Wing hallway for the first time, and you see that blood dripping from the ceiling, as you slowly look up in terror to realize there's this creepy monster staring you back in the eyes, you truly start to realize how out of your own depth you truly are. These things are terrifying, stalking you through the halls and making you second-guess yourself every time you have to backtrack through any area that includes them, forcing you to hold your breath as you slowly step your way past the blind creatures, hoping you don't slip up and make any noise, or it might just be your last mistake. It's hard to find anything bad about this title if you ask me personally, but while talking about Resident Evil 2, it made me realize that I've been doing a lot of complimenting, and I think that's mainly because it truly is a great game. However, I had to dig deep for this one just to stay honest with you, audience. All bias aside, I can fully admit that throughout our adventures in Raccoon City, This game's puzzles are not that engaging. Not that any game in the series has these super amazing, godlike puzzles, but I do tend to feel that Resident Evil 2 doesn't really do much in terms of innovating when it comes to the puzzle side of the game. It feels kind of like stepping into a kindergarten classroom. The most you'll ever end up doing is a little math, which isn't exactly a bad thing, but I mean, when we're looking at the game as a whole, it does stand out. However, Resident Evil 2 is truly one of those games that you have to experience at least once in your lifetime. Where Resident Evil 1 is a survival horror masterpiece, I think Resident Evil 2 goes beyond the genre itself and can truly lay claim to being one of the best games of all time. It's truly one of those titles where it doesn't matter where I am in my life or what I'm doing. Every time I go to pick it up, it brings me the same joy as the day I first experienced it. There is no doubt in my mind that Resident Evil 2 truly belongs in S tier.
Resident Evil.
Now this is the part of the list where I'm going to lose all my credibility with OG Resident Evil fans, and I would like to just start off by saying I know Resident Evil 3 is a good game. I don't think the game itself is a bad title, but in all honesty, I do not understand why people like this game as much as they do. I've seen countless reviews and other fans propping up Resident Evil 3 as if it's the be-all end-all of the original trilogy, and while I respect everyone's opinions, I just don't feel the same way that everyone else does when playing through this game. To start us off on a positive note, Resident Evil 3 does bring some really cool ideas to the table. One of the coolest new additions being the brand new choice system. See, in Resident Evil 2, things would change depending on what you did throughout your playthrough. Well, Resident Evil 3 takes it a step further, and multiple times throughout the story, you'll see the screen flash and be given a choice. Most of these choices boil to running away or fighting. However, I think it's really cool how they handle it. Most times, depending on what you choose in any given scenario, you'll be given a different cutscene, as well as a different area to play through, depending on the player's own choices, which can lead to a lot of replayability for those that take an interest in trying to really explore all of Raccoon City. However, I'll admit there's a flaw in this system, and it mainly comes from the fact that if you aren't already enjoying yourself, these choices can really hinder your experience. See, since most choices lead to different outcomes, this means that you'll also be getting a different story experience as well. So one player's experience with the game can differ to another, which is a good thing. However, I would say it ends up killing my mood for the game personally. Since I don't really enjoy playing it that much, I don't feel the need to experience the other outcomes of the choices. So most times, I find myself being disappointed when I attempt new things in regards to the choice system, leading me to either play the same way I have in the past, or trying new options and disliking my experience more. However, Resident Evil 3 doesn't stop innovating there. We touched on it a little bit while talking about Resident Evil 2, and now in 3, stalker enemies have made their triumphant return, and for some players this is considered to be one of the greater things in this game. Throughout your playthrough, you'll find yourself being chased by another tyrant, just like Resident Evil 2, and fans have dubbed this one Nemesis, in reference to the way that he hunts you down and tries to kill you all game, as well as the game's subtitle, Resident Evil Nemesis. Now gameplay-wise, Nemesis is a vast improvement on what Mr. X was in Resident Evil 2. All you ever had to do was get through a door and you were safe. However, in 3, it's not so easy. This is your Nemesis after all. Just because you happen to escape for a little bit doesn't mean that he's going to give up so easily. Nemesis will chase you through entire areas if you aren't careful. This hulking behemoth of a tyrant isn't just going to slap you up either. See, Umbrella installed some brains on this one, and he's going to come at you with anything and everything. Oftentimes, you might even find yourself dodging rockets as he fires at you with his missile launcher. Nemesis is definitely no pushover. When he arrives, you better make sure you know what you're doing, because if you don't, he is not going to give you the time to figure it out. And here comes where I start to rant a little bit. As stated earlier, I recognize that technically all of these things are good and vast improvements to the series. However, I just do not find stalker enemies scary. Oftentimes, when Nemesis shows up, I just find myself getting frustrated and increasingly annoyed. I already have my issues with the game's story not being that interesting to me, so having Nemesis thrown at me in all of the game's major sections ends up kinda killing any enjoyment, or just any will to explore that I already had. The cool thing is that you can still knock him down so that he stops bothering you, and if you choose to do so, you'll be rewarded kindly with some very nice items, Sometimes weapon upgrades, other times entire brand new weapons themselves. But I just never see the need to actually dump all of my ammo into him. Especially given that oftentimes when you fight Nemesis, you're either spamming the game's new dodge feature and not getting hit while using up all of your ammo, or you're getting your shit absolutely slapped by him. It never truly feels like a fun back and forth when you interact with him. The game does have a lot of good that comes with it though, like the new dodge feature the game introduces. While not the craziest thing, it is nice to be able to perform a last minute dodge to try and save some HP while you're exploring Raccoon City. Speaking of Raccoon City, that is something I think the game does a very good job of early on, allowing you to truly see just how horrendous everything is on the street level of a major outbreak. For a solid 30 to 40% of the game, you'll be running around the infested streets of Raccoon City, just trying to escape and take a breather any chance you get. And I think it's lovely seeing the city get expanded upon so much after everything you got to experience in Resident Evil 2. Even some of the other sections in the game can be quite cool as well. One that comes to mind is the Clock Tower section, one of the last remaining areas offering up rescue. Jill and Carlos find themselves desperately fighting through an old clock tower just to get to the end and have Nemesis destroy their only means of escape right in front of their own eyes. I want to sit here and say so much more about Resident Evil 3, but I've realized I've given this game so many chances throughout the years, and even though I know it's good, there's just something about it that feels so unfun and half-baked to me. I find myself replaying it every once in a while to see if I ever change my opinion, and surprisingly, nothing much ever seems to change. I always find that I have the same complaints and can never really truly enjoy the experience that is Resident Evil 3. Along with all the good it does for the series, I think it's time to admit that I just don't care for this entry. Given that knowledge, I think it's only fair to pay it some dues and put it at least in B tier.
Resident Evil 4.
Spain, huh? Yeah, this'll be fun. Jumping forward 7 years after the Raccoon City incident, we catch up with Leon S. Kennedy, who's a long way from home, and he's no longer a rookie. Tasked with saving the president's daughter, Leon is sent out to rural Spain to investigate Ashley Graham's kidnapping and rumors of a brand new virus. Resident Evil 4 sets a tone immediately. We're no longer in Kansas anymore, and we're not dealing with the average zombies that we've grown accustomed to. This time, it's a whole new ordeal. Las Plagas, a parasite that takes control of the host's brain and slowly corrupts their mind, mutating the local villagers into grotesque monstrosities, not quite unlike what we've seen before with antagonists like William Birkin. Right out of the gate, Resident Evil 4 is already breaking down new boundaries for the series. Newcomers to the franchise might not recognize it, but this was the first Resident Evil that had gone with the third-person camera. And oh boy, was it ever a great decision. Now don't get me wrong, I love fixed camera angles as much as the next guy, but this ushered in a whole new era of possibilities for gaming. Without Resident Evil 4 experimenting with the camera like this, you might never have had your favorite games to this day. But it's not just the camera that's changed. Leon himself is on a whole new level from where he was in Raccoon City. He's no longer the scared rookie cop just trying his best to survive the given circumstances. No. See, this is Resident Evil 4 Leon. He's been putting in overtime in the shadows, and now he's ready to put all of that experience to use. The poor villagers never saw him coming. From start to finish, this game is an absolute blast to play through. To this day, I don't think any of the Resident Evil games have nailed their combat systems like this, with the fine balance of struggling to survive and being an absolute badass, something I feel only Resident Evil 4 can lay claim to. This game gets crazy with it as well. Nothing feels more responsive and fun than shooting a villager in the face, only to run up and suplex him and knock down the wave of incoming threats, all just trying to get a piece of you. But don't play too good. Resident Evil 4 didn't just innovate on the combat and the camera. This is also the series' first, and I'll say its best, implementation of the adaptive difficulty system. For those of you unaware of what that means, when you start up the game for the first time, you can set your difficulty to one of 3 options, which will give you a baseline to start from. But as you play through the story of the game, depending on just how good or bad you're doing, the game will adapt and change to how you play, which will make the experience truly suited to you. Running low on healing items because you can't dodge an enemy to save your life? Well, lucky for you. Now the adaptive difficulty system is coded to spawn more healing items in your areas. Taking out every villager with ease? Well, guess what? They have armored helmets now, stopping you from headshotting them and taking them down so easily, as well as you'll find yourself not having as much ammo spawn in while you continue your adventure. I could go on about Resident Evil 4's adapted difficulty for days, but for your sakes, let's just call it amazing and move on. With the game's brand new combat comes more challenging enemy types and bosses, and oh boy are the bosses fun. You have Delago, a massive fish-like creature that drags you around the lake, trying to swallow you whole with every bit of its mobility and strength, just as you try to hold onto your boat for dear life, because God help you if you fall into that lake. Then there's the El Gigante. Now you may have thought tyrants were big, but holy shit. They are nothing compared to the size of this hulking behemoth. If you're not careful, he'll crush you like the bug that you are. But that's not all. Even regular enemies in the game will give you a run for your money, like the iconic Dr. Salvador, with his chainsaw ready to separate your head from your shoulders at a moment's notice. Or what about the Regenerators, stalking you in the tight corridors of the prison, breathing down your neck, walking at you like the unstoppable force that they are. And this is just the top of the list. We didn't even get to the Verdugo, Novistadors, Iron Maidens, Garradors, U3, or even any of the many Plaga mutations of the standard villagers that you'll meet throughout the game. There's so much fun and variety in the way that Resident Evil 4 approaches the player with its gameplay that I don't think any other game even comes close. There's so much to talk about and so little time. We haven't even gotten started on all of the bonus content included in the game. I mean, what's Resident Evil without some kick-ass unlockables and extra scenarios, am I right? After beating the game for the first time, you unlock multiple new game modes, those of which being Separate Ways, which is a story expansion taking you through Ada's adventures throughout Spain, showing you what she's been up to whilst Leon is busy rescuing the president's daughter. Then there's Assignment Ada, a short time-based mode where you play as Ada and have to make your way through the island section of the game. Following that, you gain access to an all-new game mode called Mercenaries, where you get to pick from multiple of the series' characters, which all have their own starting loadouts and powers. Then you go into a battle arena and do your best to get the highest score possible by killing as much shit as you can within the time limit, which would go on to be a series staple from this point forward. But that's not all. It is Resident Evil tradition that after beating the game, you'll unlock some brand new outfits for both you and Ashley, as well as a host of upgrades in the in-game stores for your weapons. And to go even further, if you beat the game on Professional, you unlock not only another set of costumes, but also the series' most busted New Game Plus unlockable to this date, the PLR 412. Simply point this thing in the direction of an enemy and watch them fade from existence. There is no way to truly explain to you just how amazing and fun this game is in such a short amount of time. Resident Evil 4 is an all-time classic, and easily the best game in the series. There is so much more I wish I could say about this game, but really, how can anyone else argue against it? Without any doubt, feel free to say I'm glazing, but it's just fact. Resident Evil 4 belongs in S tier.
Resident Evil 5.
You know, it's been a while since we've seen Chris in action. I wonder what he's getting up to right about now. Ah, right. Resident Evil 5. This game is an interesting entry in the series for many different reasons. One of the main ones you hear all around the internet is how this is when the series went full action. And while people aren't wrong to say that, I feel like it should be prefaced that it's not necessarily a bad thing. A series does have to evolve at some point. However, for a lot of us longtime fans, this is when Resident Evil started to jump the shark a little bit more than we were used to. However, I'm not really here to review the games if that hasn't been made abundantly clear by now. With that said, I quite enjoy Resident Evil 5. While yes, it does have its boring moments and can definitely be a little batshit insane sometimes, I find myself coming back to this one pretty regularly. Resident Evil 5 can be a great game at times. I have a lot of fond memories of staying up late, going through the campaign with many different friends and having a blast. The game takes Resident Evil 4's mechanics and spices them up just a little bit with some quality of life improvements, and it allows you to play it with a friend. It doesn't get any more fun than that. Although with that being said, with the direction the series moves in, the game does lose a sizable amount of its fear factor, and ends up becoming more of a co-op buddy shooter than the survival horror that we fans have come to know and love throughout the years. The game does still maintain an overall aura of horror. I mean, after all, it is still attempting to be a horror game. But with the whole co-op thing and the hard pan to more action sequences, I find myself not really feeling much when the game does try to lock in and creep out the player. That's another thing. Your experience in Resident Evil 5 is entirely different depending on if you choose to play this game solo or in co-op. In solo, I do actually find that those horror elements the game attempts do tend to land a little bit better, being that you're by yourself and don't really have a friend distracting you or spouting nonsense in your ear 24/7. But the trade-off is that you end up having to play the game with a horrendous AI. And for a game that was primarily designed with co-op in mind, having an AI partner that is at most times unresponsive or downright doing everything in its power to get you killed can absolutely kill any good vibes you were having. It's not a constant problem, but every now and then it rears its head and it can really get under your skin. Unfortunately, something that can't be saved by the co-op is the game's poor level design. In comparison to the series' past, no longer is it about slowly exploring around and avoiding danger, gathering up resources to solve puzzles, and eventually battling your way forward. Now it's just strict linear pathways, devoid of exploration, that just take you from one area to battle enemies to the next. While writing this script, I can't even remember more than 2 segments in the game that required a little bit of exploration and puzzle solving. And even then, the most you end up doing is going from corner to corner, collecting one item, then moving back to center. So while going through and shooting everything sounds fun, it can get really tiring about midway through the game. One thing I haven't touched on when talking about the game so far for this list has been the stories, but Resident Evil 5 kinda has to be talked about, since this is the first time a Resident Evil game goes out of its way to wrap up a long-running major plotline. That being Chris hunting down Wesker throughout the series to stop him from destroying the world with bioterrorism. And while the story itself isn't the craziest thing in the world, it really feels so fun to see the final collision of long-running series rivals, Chris and Wesker. The story kinda plays itself out similar to a B-movie action plot, with Chris and his new partner Sheva following breadcrumbs through Africa on the hunt to understand a new virus in town, Ouroboros. Along their adventure, they learn the spread of the virus has ties to Wesker, leading to a wild goose chase across Africa, ending in a final bout between the two rivals in a volcano of all places, to finally put an end to Wesker's evil once and for all. While this story may not have the quality of a Tarantino film, it's pure fun, dumb action slop, and I and many others are absolutely here for it. Resident Evil 5 leaves me conflicted, because at moments when playing the game, I truly feel like I'm on top of the world and having so much fun. But then you cut forward an hour, and I get over that high. It just feels like I'm dragging my feet through the mud, just trying to reach the ending. While writing this, I wanted to give the game so much more credit, given my fond memories and experiences with it. However, these days, I just feel so 50-50 on it, so I've come to the conclusion that Resident Evil 5 goes into B tier. It's good, but it has its flaws.
Resident Evil 6.
Everything's gone to shit. The president's dead. There's bioterrorism outbreaks as far as the eye can see, secret plots made by shadow governments to seize control of the world, and in the midst of it all sits our main characters, lost, confused, and just trying to get to the bottom of everything, to stop what just might be the end of the world. Resident Evil 6 is all over the place, and probably one of the hardest entries to not only try and rank, but to even talk about without just straight up rambling for hours. The game at the time was meant to be the be-all, end-all Resident Evil, doing its best to bring everybody together for one final outing, bringing back the likes of Leon, Chris, Sherry, and Ada, along with series newcomers Jake Muller, Piers Nivens, and Helena Harper, giving players at the time a different experience for each different campaign included in the game. For horror fans, you had Leon and Helena's campaign. For the action fans, you had Chris and Piers' campaign. Those of you that enjoyed the blend of action and horror that came from Resident Evil 3 and 4 will be looking more towards Jake and Sherry's campaign, and an all-new fourth playstyle is added, focusing on a more stealth-based style of action and horror, which is what you'll get and find in Ada's campaign. Does it sound like a lot? Because it sure is. And in comes the biggest issue with Resident Evil 6. It's just trying to do too much. You can't please everybody, and unfortunately, that's the primary design point behind Resident Evil 6, leaving it to fall flat for many players, when at one point they get exactly what they're looking for, and in the next campaign they play, it's an entirely different game, and you end up slogging your way through it just to piece together a really long and convoluted story. Speaking of long, these campaigns can be very long-winded. Most players end up spending roughly 5 to 6 hours for one story, and you still have 3 more to go through afterwards. So by the time you finish one, you're already a little burnt out, and questioning if it's even worth it just to continue and experience the story. Which really sucks, because Resident Evil 6 has a fun story to tell with all the characters having interwoven story moments and working together to save the world, but the way everything is structured in this game, most players end up never experiencing it, because it's just not feasible for players to spend so much time in something they don't like, just to get another part that they may end up liking or hating even more. I tend to find myself enjoying Resident Evil 6 much more than others do, and I feel it deserves much more credit than most give it. The game itself can be really fun to play. I feel like it improves on the worst things in Resident Evil 5's gameplay and adds a few new things of its own to keep players engaged in its combat. Like I said about Resident Evil 5, just being linear path and a battle arena repeat, 6 does a similar thing, but ends up feeling a bit more engaging with the way it tackles the areas that you get to explore. No longer does it just feel like shooting segment in the small path into shooting segment, the game now tries to give players more to do in each area, whether that be a small puzzle to solve or a fetch quest similar to what 5 would have you doing. I just think it's kinda neat. Add in the interwoven story elements of seeing the different campaigns overlap and exploring to see different characters and what they're doing at the same time, it feels like you're actually in a living, breathing world instead of just a bland set of hallways set up for players to progress. Speaking of things that 6 does well, the combat in this game gets a bad rap, and I think it's due to the lack of the game explaining it properly and a bit of a lack of creativity on the player's part. But man, can it be some of the most fun combat in the series, when you really start to dive deep into it and its variety of options. It may not have the depths of games like Devil May Cry, however, it really gives you a solid host of options to really spice up the many combat encounters you'll find yourself in throughout the game. I can't possibly list all the combinations of techniques because there's just so many, but here are some of my favorites that are fun to use. Slide shooting, quick shots, sprint attacks, melee combos, melee finishers, varied takedowns, and to wrap it up, all sorts of different movements and stamina techs that really allow you to dive deep into the game's mechanic and keep each combat feeling fresh. There's just way too much to talk about when it comes to Resident Evil 6. Honestly, it probably deserves an entire video on its own, but to keep things short, I think it's a game that deserves a second chance from the player base. It has its flaws at times, and it can honestly be a frustrating mess. I didn't even touch on any of the cool New Game Plus modes, and content as well as what might be the series' best implementation of the Mercenaries game mode. But I think given the second chance, players can come back and realize there's a solid chunks of positives to this game. And although most don't tend to like it, I think in my own personal opinion, Resident Evil 6 gets B tier. Five years removed from any mainline numbered entries in the series, Resident Evil decided to take a step back and return to the series' roots based in horror. This time with all new characters and a brand new storyline, following Ethan Winters, a man on the search for his lost wife, Mia Winters, who disappeared not too long ago. After which, Ethan receives an email calling him to come find her at her family's home. Wait a minute. This is starting to sound a little familiar. Meh, I'm sure it's nothing. Resident Evil 7, on its way back to the series' roots, trying to get in touch with the horror side of things, introduces the series to an all-new first-person camera, giving the player a more personal experience and upfront look at all the brand new terrors the game throws at you, allowing yourself to become truly immersed in the perfectly crafted atmosphere of the Deep South located Baker Mansion, as well as the game's many other areas. Resident Evil 7 does a great job of crafting its environments to make you feel uneasy as you walk through the Texas Chainsaw-like mansion, just trying to do whatever you can to catch your breath and get away from everything, even if it's just for a moment. Although, while the game does an amazing job with its atmosphere and level design, it falls flat in the enemies category, only having so much as 4 different enemies that you'll encounter, excluding stalker enemies, those of which being the mold, a mold crawler, mold but fat, and bug. If we include stalker enemies, which we'll talk about soon, that adds about 2 more to the list with Jack and Marguerite Baker. So while traversing through the areas, you'll soon realize there isn't much of a threat to go along with all of that creepy atmosphere. So eventually throughout the game, it tends to lose its meaning for me personally. Speaking of the stalker enemies, they make a return, again. And they're okay. I feel like there isn't too much to say on this front anymore. The series has included so many at this point, and they all end up just being different versions of the same thing. But I'll give 7 some credit and say that Jack and Marguerite can be quite fun. They add a lot of character with these stalker enemies. They aren't just large, non-speaking entities that want you dead. Most of the time they add in their own little quips and funny antics, like when Jack sneaks up on you and says, "Welcome to the family, son." You like my impression? I don't. Which gives them a bit more interesting character than your average stalker enemy. Although, as with most stalker enemies, I don't tend to find them much of a threat. If anything, they end up being more of an annoyance than anything, but they do have their fun moments. What I think Resident Evil 7 does best is its attempt at story. Although our new character Ethan is kind of bland, I do quite enjoy what the game does with Evelyn, a bioweapon created by the Connections, as a mean to eliminate enemies without the need for combat. During her creation, all hell breaks loose, and her and Mia wash up on the shores unconscious at the Baker Mansion, where Evelyn, being a selfish little girl, desperate for a family to love and care for her, abuses her power of the mold instilled within her to warp the minds of the Baker family and Mia to become one big twisted, infected family, all to satisfy her own selfish wants and needs. I find it to be a really interesting plot point in this game, because it makes a lot of sense that creating a little girl and her learning about how families work and how she never got the luxury to experience that love, seeing as she was grown in a lab and only ever used for others' benefits, that it would only ever lead to something catastrophic like the events that take place in Resident Evil 7. It's for this reason that I find myself continuing through Resident Evil 7. The story has well-crafted moments like these that keep me interested and willing to push through the gameplay that I otherwise don't really care for too much. 7 does a great job of bringing the series back down to earth and really focusing on getting back to more horror elements and trying to create another entry in the series that fans could be scared of. However, it tends to fall flat in some of its gameplay for me, and there isn't much replayability in a title like this. So, sorry to all you Resident Evil 7 fans, but I think it's just a solid B. Wait a minute, this game doesn't say the title screen? It's like the whole video. What am I supposed to do now? Resident Evil Village. Well, that was shit. 4 years have passed since the Baker incident, and... What the hell? Chris? We don't have time for these stupid rankings. No time to explain. S tier. Moving on. What the fuck was that? Oh, right. We're talking about Village now. That tracks, I guess. Well, sorry, Chris, but it's not gonna be so simple. See, Resident Evil 8's a weird game for me. One moment I'm having the time of my life, running through the village and all of its different set pieces, exploring for items and taking care of the game's primary antagonist. And then in the next moments, I'm dreadfully watching the cutscenes to the game and realizing just how ridiculous this story is. In no other Resident Evil game have I really felt like this before, where I enjoy the gameplay so strongly and what it brings to the table, especially with it being so close to what Resident Evil 4 did in the past. But then as soon as I start following the story in this game, it just takes me out immediately. and I no longer feel immersed in what's going on, leaving me confused and overall just less interested in playing such a fun game. There are times in Village where I feel that the story is handled well. I like the overall idea of Ethan's daughter being kidnapped by a cult for their own sadistic needs, and it's up to him to rescue the only family he has left. Silent Hill did it. But for every good moment we have in the story, we get a bad moment, like Chris busting down Ethan's door, shooting his wife directly in front of him and saying, "Well, sorry Ethan, there's no time to explain," which is just the most asinine thing. Like, really, Chris? You couldn't spare one moment to tell Ethan what's going on? Not even a, "that isn't your wife"? It's moments like these that just really throw me off and kind of ruin my experience with the title. Especially because most times when I'm playing a game, it's primarily to focus on the story coming from a new entry, which I know isn't the same feeling for most players, but it has more of an effect on me personally. Moving on from the story though, as stated earlier, I quite enjoy the gameplay itself in this title. Where in Resident Evil 7, it felt like there wasn't really ever anything going on in terms of combat, Village kicks it up a notch and actually includes a variety of enemies and interesting areas to combat them. One of my favorite moments that comes to mind is after beating 3 of the 4 major antagonists, you'll be contacted to meet up with the 4th, Heisenberg. But before you can get to his location, you have to go through the Lycan Stronghold, which is a dangerous nest brimming with different types of enemies, just ready to rip you to shreds at any moment. It's moments like these in the game where I find my interest starts to spike. Being thrown into these well-crafted areas swarming with enemies and the immense dread I get from the atmosphere really locks me into Ethan's resolve, and it showcases that he's really willing to do whatever it takes to rescue his own daughter and bring her home safely. Along with the shift towards more combat in this title, the game brings back the shop system featured previously in Resident Evils 4, 5, and 6, which, if I'm being biased here, is actually quite nice to interact with again. But it's not just the same old shop reintroduced, it actually has a new feature, new to this game. The shop now gives the player a new quest-like system to go hunt out different types of animals for the Duke's Kitchen. And if you do so, you'll be rewarded with different stat increases, such as reinforced blocking or increased health, which can be mighty helpful to the player throughout their journey, and it adds an incentive to explore the village and the other areas in the game. Overall, Resident Evil 8's a fun experience to get through, and I'd say it's a pretty damn good game if it weren't for my own feelings on the game's attempt at storytelling. It would probably rank a lot higher, but I feel even with that caveat, the game itself can be really fun to play through, and I find myself returning to it every so often just to re-experience the fun I had. With that being said, I'm gonna give Village the benefit of the doubt and put it in A for today. However, I'll be fully honest and say, depending on that day, it could be a B, but for now, I think A is fair. Cut to 2026, and we open up on FBI investigator Grace Ashcroft, as she's assigned to investigate a recent string of mysterious murders, where the victims all share the same markings on their corpses. When eventually a body is found in a place where Grace's mother was murdered many years ago, leading Grace to eventually investigate the old hotel that her mom and her used to reside in, only to get kidnapped and end up in a nightmare of which she's never experienced before. Unbeknownst to Grace, there's somebody else investigating this string of murders as well. Who might that be, I wonder? That's right, Leon is back, and it turns out these aren't just murders, but people suffering from a long-dormant form of the T-virus that has started to mutate in the bodies of all known Raccoon City survivors. While searching for answers, these two collide in the perfect blend of action and horror, the likes of which makes Resident Evil 6 jealous, as this is exactly what that game tried to achieve. While Resident Evil Requiem only came out recently, it's easily one of the series' best outing throughout its tenure. This game does an amazing job, start to finish, of blending the series' most prevalent genres in a way that we haven't really seen before. It goes the Resident Evil 6 route of having different planned genres for different playable characters. However, where Resident Evil 6 fails by making an entire new campaign for each genre and ends up becoming a bloated mess, Requiem keeps it simple. You have one story, two playable characters, and each of which are tied to their own genre. Leon with action, and Grace, the newcomer, with horror. And periodically, you'll swap between them at key moments to piece together the full picture of the game's story, similar to how Devil May Cry 5 tackled its story. Where when you're playing as Grace, you'll have a more Resident Evil 7/8 style of gameplay, focused more on trying to scare the player. A great example of this being the game's opening hour, where Grace wakes up in Rhodes Hill Care Facility, finding herself kidnapped by the main antagonist, Victor Gideon. She wakes up strapped to a gurney. After breaking free, she finds herself in pitch-black corridors, searching for a way out when ultimately she ends up finding herself being stalked by this giant, mutated monstrosity of a little girl. After running away, Leon, who's just blasted his way through the streets of Renwood and the bottom floors of Rhodes Hill, comes just in the nick of time to save Grace, but not before immediately being separated again, giving the players only a taste of the action-packed moments to come while playing as Leon. While playing as Leon in Requiem, you'll notice it takes a lot of things from how Resident Evil 4, OG, and Remake play. It brings back Leon's kick-ass action finishers after stunning enemies, as well as giving Leon a permanent melee, which, returning from the remake of 4, can now parry enemy attacks, allowing Leon to counterattack just about everything. And seriously, I beat it, just about everything. This is one strong fucking axe, because throughout your playthrough, it does not matter what is thrown at you, be it cars, mortars, RPGs, and spoilers, even the final boss after mutating into your standard Resident Evil boss monstrosity, you can even parry his massive, towering tentacles. It's absolutely insane, and also one of the most fun mechanics in the entire game to play around with. But it doesn't just end there. The shop has also returned, giving Leon a whole host of weapons to play around with, and upgrade throughout your adventure. They really nailed making you feel like the badass that Leon always has been. Although, as good as a game as Requiem is, I do have a few minor complaints. Nothing too crazy, but I think they should be touched on nonetheless. One of my biggest complaints about the game lies in its attempt at a New Game Plus system, where in previous titles you would overwrite a completed save file and load into New Game Plus with all of your previous items and upgrades to boot, along with new unlocks. However, Requiem handles this a little differently. Although you can bring new unlockables into its second playthrough, you don't start off with all of your upgrades, and instead, you have to rebuy everything and regrind for all the shop points that you previously had, to then buy the new weapons that you just spent completion points on in the main menu. And honestly, I have no idea why they did this. It's not the biggest grind, but it's just like, why make me pay for it with completion points if you're just gonna make me buy it in the in-game shop anyway? Unlike in games like Resident Evil 4, where you would just unlock it by completing a challenge, and then use your money from previous playthroughs to purchase your new unlocks by the in-game merchant. It just doesn't make much sense. Speaking of New Game Plus playthroughs, there's a very slow segment about halfway through the game, where you jump from playing as Leon to a little girl in Raccoon City Orphanage. And although we haven't touched on Resident Evil 2 Remake just yet, those familiar with that game are already going to understand what I'm going to say. While playing as the little girl, it boils down to run one place, wait for a scripted scare to happen, hide for a minute, then repeat, and do it again for the next 6 minutes. On your first playthrough, it's not that big of a deal. It can be a nice experience, but if you're like me and love to play the games multiple times for all the unlocks, you'll find yourself absolutely dreading playing this segment over and over again, almost making you wish you had a skip button. You know, I'm sure there's a mod for it at this point. Might be worth looking into. To avoid spoilers, I don't want to linger on this upcoming topic too much, but I do have a minor complaint about the game's story as well. Now, I think 95% of this story is decently thought out and a blast to get through, but I just hate how they took the route of not fully explaining some of the game's overarching plot elements, and instead, it seems like they're planning to do so in a future DLC, which to me is just kind of a shitty video game practice that I, as a consumer, am getting a little tired of. Like, I paid full price for the game, I want the full story. All in all, Resident Evil Requiem's a blast to play through. So much so that the game hadn't even been out for a full week, and I already managed to 100% the game, playing it every day since launch. If it weren't for some of the caveats that I listed earlier, Requiem would easily be S tier. I don't know if that's just recency bias, but I truly believe it would be. However, given those caveats, I think the game rightfully deserves its placement in A tier, and I hope everyone gets the experience to play this game at some point in their lives. 21 years have passed since the last time we stepped in Raccoon City, and now it's back and looking better than ever. In 2019, Capcom decided it was time for the series to get a bit of a facelift. After fans have been begging them to remake the older titles, they finally gave in and presented to the world Resident Evil 2 Remake. The same classic adventure you know and love, with all new fancy graphics and rebuilt from the ground up around the series' most popular third-person camera. For these remake sections, I'll try not to repeat myself so much, given that in essence, deep down, these are still the same games, just with minor critiques and changes. Or, at least sometimes minor, but we'll get to that. Resident Evil 2 is like a trip down memory lane, but your memory isn't all that good, and you only remember bits and pieces here and there. The game does a great job of still keeping just about everything from the original intact, but just moving them ever so slightly, so that even old players can have a new experience. A fun example would be the moved location of where you interact with the Lickers for the first time. So returning players from the original have their expectations subverted, and they end up being more surprised when they reach the third floor on the west side of the RPD, and see one flash its way past the window just before getting to your first cutscene with one. Very similar to how the original game handled it, just in a brand new spot. One of the things I really love about this remake is how in the original game, I would argue the best part was when you got to explore the RPD, but it wasn't really that long of a section, and most times it would only really take you roughly 30 minutes to an hour if you didn't know what you were doing, but in this remake they really expand upon the RPD section of the game. Almost maybe a little too much. Since things have been moved around a bit, they took the opportunity to make things a bit more grandiose. The one thing that comes to mind is the statues and their respective medallions. Now throughout your adventure in the RPD, you'll be looking for 3 big statues: the lion statue, the unicorn statue, and finally, the maiden statue. This has now become your primary objective in the RPD, because this will be how you escape. Unlike in the original, after completing a few story interactions and puzzles, you end up leaving through the RPD through the sewers. However, the remake actually reuses some of the things in the original, like the detonator sequence in the OG where you would normally blow up the wall to get past the helicopter wreckage. In the remake, you'll now be using it in the game's third floor instead, to blow up some old rickety wall to gain access to one of the 3 medallions mentioned previously. I like the way this is handled because it gives you more time to explore arguably the most interesting section in the game. However, where things take an interesting turn, not all changes to the game are made equally. Further along in your adventure, depending on your scenario, you'll find yourself swapping to play as either Ada or Sherry. Now this was in the original too, but both characters practically had the same experience. Move a couple boxes, have a cutscene, then swap back to your main character. However, in the remake, they decided to flesh this out a bit more, and in Ada's case, I believe it was handled wonderfully. Now in the sewer section of the game, you'll swap to Ada as Leon is unconscious, and you'll get to run around solving new, albeit not very interesting puzzles with Ada's new spy gadget, allowing her to hack electronics and move around the sewers just a little bit easier as she hunts down Annette Birkin for answers to what Ada's after. The Sherry section, however, I think is a bit of a downgrade, and an upgrade at the same time. After she gets kidnapped by Chief Irons in the garage segment, you're then swapped over to Sherry to play as her in the Raccoon City orphanage, leading to a pretty drawn-out run-and-hide segment where Sherry attempts to break free from the orphanage while Irons is hunting her down. I find myself getting really bored during this section. It's nice because it fleshes out the Chief Irons character more, and it goes into some deeper lore that I'm not going to touch on, but having your playthrough come to a screeching halt and being forced to slow everything down and hide from Chief Irons for 15 to 20 minutes kinda kills the pacing of the game, and it leaves me just begging to get back to playing as Claire. I want to touch on this very briefly as well, since there isn't a really good place to talk about it, but the remake does make the different scenarios from the original feel less needed, since nothing too drastic changes from scenario A to B. Unlike in the original, where your actions tended to have a bit more weight behind them. Just wanted to say that a little bit. All in all, there isn't too much to talk about when it comes to Resident Evil 2 Remake. It's a damn good game. Some of the changes made I don't really care for too much, but at the end of the day, it's still Resident Evil 2, and you have to try pretty damn hard to fuck that up. So with that being said, I think it's pretty easy to guess this, but I think it's going into A tier. Resident Evil 3 Remake, unfortunately, is nothing like the quality of Resident Evil 2 Remake. So much so that anything I'm gonna say in this section is just repeats of what you'll find elsewhere on the internet. So I'll try to keep it somewhat brief and keep this section short, just like all the cut content in this game. You see what I did there? Resident Evil 3 Remake falls flat in so many areas. Where Resident Evil 2 would change things up little by little to give returning players a bit of a fresh experience while still maintaining the overall vibe and character of the original game, Resident Evil 3 Remake just kinda shits on everything the original did. While it does have its good moments, mainly coming from the revamped gameplay now being similar to that of RE2 Remake, as well as evolving the original dodge mechanic from Resident Evil 3, I fear that that's kind of where the positives for this segment end. So much in this remake is just missing. Even while walking through Raccoon City, it just feels so empty and null, like nothing's even happening, despite the fact that everything is on fire and an outbreak nothing like the world had ever seen at this point is going on. Instead, Jill is just kind of walking around empty spaces with barely any enemies or content to explore. Just going from one place to grab an item, then move to another entirely bland area with nothing in it. It just feels like there's no meaning to anything that's going on anymore. Not to mention that the remake removes a lot of exploration to be done, and entire sections from the game even. Like, you no longer have the gas station to explore or the diner anymore. I'm sure you've all heard about the fact that the entire clock section of the game, one of the most story-dependent areas from the original, isn't even included. But it's not just those areas either. The Gravedigger boss isn't here anymore, the entire lab section at the end of the game is different and infinitely less inspired. They did manage to expand upon the hospital section of the game and make it a bit more interesting. But when looking at everything surrounding it, you almost forget that it's even in the game. They somehow even managed to make Nemesis, of all things, less interesting. Half the time he shows up, it's kinda just boiled down to a special cutscene event, and a couple not so interesting boss fights at this point. He'll still show up and chase you, and when that happens, it's kinda neat because he's a lot more athletic in this game, and a much bigger threat, but it only happens maybe once or twice during the street segments of the game, which only last maybe an hour. So for the rest of the game, you only ever see Nemesis right before a boss fight with him, or he just shows up in a cutscene to pester you, and then he just fucks off. I don't really want to talk about this game anymore. I'll give it some props that it fleshes out the Umbrella mercenaries like Carlos and Tyrell, giving them something more to do throughout the story than just being a talking head that Jill runs into. But even then, it's not enough to save this game. I'm gonna be nice and ease up on it, given the fact that the game isn't a full price game anymore, coming in at roughly $40 US, but that is the only reason, besides maybe the RE2 mechanics, that is saving this game from D tier. I'll give it a C, but just know that it barely reaches that category.
Resident Evil 4.
Following the disaster that was Resident Evil 3 Remake, Capcom was still riding high on the idea of remaking the series' older titles. However, they decided to listen to fan feedback and not rush headfirst into this one. Given what they did with Resident Evil 3 and the fan outrage that brought in, they wanted to make sure they could give Resident Evil 4 the love and respect it deserved. Something along the lines of what they did in the past with Resident Evil 2 Remake. And they actually tend to follow the same design philosophy that was present for Resident Evil 2 as well. Like stated earlier, the remakes tend to be roughly the same games with updated story elements to flesh out past characters and plotlines, as well as mostly keeping the core sections that you had in the original intact, only moving things over for the most part. Resident Evil 4 Remake tends to move things around a lot more than 2 did though. And like stated previously, I'm all for the idea of creating a fresher experience for returning players, but it can get a little too creative sometimes. One of my bigger complaints I had while revisiting this title was the removal of the U3 boss. Although I know most players don't care, I liked the boss in the small maze from the original, so I kind of miss it. And before you get on me and say, but Insidious, it's in the DLC with Ada, you just have to go play that. I'm a firm believer of the idea that removing content that was previously available and locking it behind DLC is pretty fucking scummy. Even if it is an entirely new experience to what the original Separate Ways was like, you know, I just don't care. even to this day, I haven't even purchased the DLC and experienced it, just because of that fact alone. But it's not just the removal of U3 that bothers me. Typically when you have remakes, the developers of the games try to fix the problematic areas from the originals. But when it comes to Resident Evil 4 Remake, they spent so much time revamping and bloating up the village section, which was already pretty damn good, that they barely even changed the island section, which is the most, biggest part that people complain about whenever it comes to playthroughs of Resident Evil 4. So it kinda rubs me the wrong way that they would keep the problematic section practically the same, but then go out of their way to make a bunch of tiny changes in other segments that end up just dragging things on, and to me, personally not lending much more to the experience. This game does add in some pretty neat things though that expand upon the original Resident Evil 4's ideas, as well as its entirely new things exclusive to this remake. I think they can be pretty awesome. Like for example, the merchant is back, and for the most part, nothing much has changed. However, if you remember the Blue Medallion quest from the original, it's been revamped for this game. And not only just that, but more quests from the merchants have been added in, similarly to what the Duke does in Village. Mainly ranging from fetch quests to simple puzzles, doing them will grant you different rewards at the merchant to explore, and have fun with to your heart's content. I find myself enjoying this feature because it encourages me to explore more of the areas I find myself in throughout the remake, and it makes me appreciate all the love that went into spicing these old areas up. But it doesn't just stop there. We talked about it a little bit in Requiem, but Resident Evil 4 Remake goes the extra mile, and it adds in a brand new feature that you're now able to parry enemy attacks with the knife that you keep around you all game. And although it may not be as batshit insane as Requiem's axe, god damn, that thing was fucking crazy, it's still a very fun feature to play around with, and it leads to more variety in your average combat encounters, overall spicing up the game's combat. One more tiny, final complaint that's definitely not a bad thing about this game, but a bit more personal to me, is the change from Krauser's cutscene and boss fight in the remake. Instead of quick-time events taking place during the cutscene that you first meet Krauser, when he's dropping in all of his lore on you, you'll now actually be able to do the knife fight yourself, which can be really cool and fun, but every time I play through this section, if I'm being honest with you, I find myself so focused on the actual fight itself, which is cool because then the gameplay's great, but I completely miss out on all of Krauser's story and lore. Luckily, I'm not new to the series, and I already know about all of it, but for a new player, I can only imagine just how confusing it is having some random soldier drop in on you with all this knowledge and just start attacking you. Keeping this short, Resident Evil 4 Remake is a damn good, and I mean damn good game. You know, it's the same thing with 2. It's pretty hard to fuck up Resident Evil 4. However, it does make some puzzling changes that I myself am not too much of a fan of, leading to this entry coming in just a little bit lower than the original, but still overall placing very nicely at a solid A tier.
Resident Evil.
I want to like Code Veronica. I really do. However, after a recent replay of the game for this video, I found myself having a change of opinion on this title. In concept, on paper, this game should be great. Picking up from where we left Claire at the end of Resident Evil 2, she abandons Leon and Sherry to continue her quest to find her brother, Chris Redfield, leading to her eventual capture and imprisonment on Rockford Island, an isolated secret prison ran by the evil Umbrella Corporation and its secret service. While on the island, an outbreak of the T and Veronica virus break loose, leading to Claire needing to escape as soon as possible. During her escape, she finds hidden Umbrella documents pertaining to Chris, and in that moment contacts Leon to then contact Chris to make him aware of Claire's current situation, which if I'm being honest, is a little confusing. However, learning that there is a new virus being developed, Claire and her new partner, Steve, who, trust me, we'll get to, are in a race to escape the island and get to the bottom of everything that Umbrella is up to. All while Chris is here trying to save Claire, I guess. It's a little all over the place. On paper, continuing the plot points from 2 and catching up from Chris and what he's been doing since Resident Evil 1 is really cool, but it does tend to fall flat in some areas. Even if it does get handled pretty nicely overall, it's not really the plot that I have an issue with the most. It's mainly the game itself, and some of the game's frustrating, annoying characters. Oftentimes, throughout my playthrough, I would find that Code Veronica suffers from a lot of the same mistakes that Resident Evil 0 had made. I'd find myself dealing with many frustrating enemy types in locations that weren't very fun to get through. One of the more frustrating examples I can come up with is that damn poison butterfly-filled hallway in the Arctic base section of the game. Not only am I running around like a chicken with my head cut off, just trying to piece together whatever it is that I'm actually supposed to be doing, I'm having to do all of that while backtracking through this tight-knit hallway filled with fast-moving, flying poison butterflies that are constantly harassing and poisoning me at the slightest touch. And you might think, oh, just kill them so next time you enter the hallway they'll be gone. Well, unfortunately Code Veronica doesn't work this way. So not only are they extremely frustrating to kill, and at most times just a complete waste of ammo, but you don't even get the relief of not having to deal with them anymore once you finally killed them. So oftentimes it's better to just run past them, but even that's not easy. Every time you enter the hallway, you're just rolling the dice on how the AI is going to react to you. About 90% of the time I enter the hallways, it just didn't matter how perfect my pathing was. Those damn butterflies were so fast that I would always manage to get hit, and if I was lucky, I wouldn't get poisoned. But I wasn't very lucky in most cases, leading me to use lots of blue herbs throughout that section. And once you're out of blue herbs, would you like to venture a guess where the permanent blue herb station is? Did you say the poison butterfly hallway? Because you'd be correct. So not only are you trying to get rid of your poison, you run the risk of getting rid of it only to be immediately infected with it once again in the same hallway. And this wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't just a one-time thing in this game. But this happens many times in areas that you'll find yourself passing through just trying to figure out what you need to do. And enemies like these butterflies and bats will constantly chip you throughout the game just for some cheap, easy damage to get you to waste your already limited resources, just to inflate the difficulty of other sections more. And my god, is it frustrating to deal with. Not to mention that these enemies behave entirely different to enemies that you'll find in other sections. See, if you go out of your way to wipe out a horde of zombies in a hallway to make it easier to get around, just at the cost of your resources, they'll at most times actually stay dead, allowing you to explore with a minor bit of safety. But God forbid the game be consistent and apply that logic to those damn flying enemies. But it's not just them you have to look out for either. There are multiple sections where Bandersnatches, a new enemy to the game, will appear, and in almost every section you run into them, they'll just spawn off screen and cheaply attack you with their Mr. Fantastic, go-go gadget-ass extendo arm bullshit, leading you to once again get hit by an enemy that you can't do much about. So like Zero, the series was running out of fresh ideas for making enemies difficult, so it just decided to take a route of making them annoying and not fun to interact with at all. Ignoring my frustrations with the overall enemy design, I also tend to find myself getting lost and confused much more commonly in this entry in comparison to the other classic titles. I don't know what it is exactly that causes this, and it could just be a me problem, but if I had to venture a guess, it mainly has to do with the fact that the island section of the game is just so massive, and it takes forever to get around from area to area. So by the time you reach one end of the island and interact with the puzzle or key item, it leads me to completely forgetting what I was having to do on the whole other side of the island. So I end up running around for hours just trying to reread notes, re-interact with key items that I have in different spaces, just to get an inkling of what it is that I'm actually meant to do. And I think some of the confusion also spawns from the fact that there are two primary buildings with interconnected puzzles and hallways, as well as multiple floors on the opposite side from each other on this island. But they also work together when it comes to finding key items and ways to progress, so you can't just isolate one building at a time and complete one. No, you have to juggle between the two and pray that you don't forget anything throughout your journey, or you'll just be as lost as I was. I've been ranting about this game long enough. I don't think I could cover everything that I truly want to say about it in such a short amount of time. I'll just have to leave it with a few bullet points at the end here. Being that Steve is a really annoying main character that you have to partner with throughout the game. The story itself has an interesting overall main narrative following Resident Evil 2, but it gets confusing so fast and doesn't have a great payoff to everything you go through. The bosses in the game are neat, but most end up just being some sort of gimmick that is entirely skippable, or just not that fun to interact with. And I don't know, this game just doesn't hit me the same way it does other classic fans. I'm sorry to all of you Code Veronica fans, but this ain't it, Chief. I just do not like it. I'm thinking D tier for this one.
Resident Evil Revelations.
Revelations is an interesting title for me. See, this game came out after Resident Evil 5, but takes place a little after the events of Resident Evil 4, following Jill and Chris's early days in the BSAA, serving as almost a prequel to Resident Evil 5, but not quite. It's mainly just a title to fill in the gaps between major games. I really like what the Revelation series tries to do with fleshing out these sections of time in between games. As a fan, it was always a little jarring jumping between mainline titles and skipping 4 or 5 years, only to experience something entirely unrelated to what you were previously doing. So it's a neat concept to have something to flesh the world out a bit. However, that's not all that's interesting about this title. See, it was originally a handheld game being developed only for the Nintendo 3DS, something Resident Evil just had an obsession with at the time. If you ask me, it was kind of weird to originally only limit such an interesting game to such a small console, but later after fan demand, Capcom decided to port the game to all major consoles with updated controls and graphics. Here we are today. Revelations, while also trying to fill in the missing spaces in the series' overarching timeline, also takes a few steps back in a good way, and brings back the primary survival horror experiences fans were wanting at the time, after Resident Evil 5's linear level design leading to just holding W and shooting your way from one combat arena to the next. Revelations scraps that idea and kind of retouches on the series' roots, primarily focusing on one major area that you slowly explore throughout the course of the game as you place together the game's story and progress through the Queen Zenobia, a massive cruise ship scheduled for scrapping, but later disappeared, leading to the BSAA to investigate it under suspicion that it's being used for bioterrorism. And oh boy, was it being used for bioterrorism. Because at this point in the series, we're just creating viruses like candy. However, the Zenobia, while playing a lot like more classic Resident Evil titles, the game does still have its moments similar to what we said about Resident Evil 5 moments ago. See, you don't just play as Jill in this game. Depending on where you're at in the story, the game jumps you between multiple different characters that are at different places and at different times. Take for example, one moment you'll be playing as Jill on the Zenobia, and the next moment you'll hop to Chris, who's somewhere in the middle of the fucking Arctic, trying to locate Jill and get more details on the Zenobia. And it's when these sections happen that the game takes like a much more linear approach, similar to that of RE5. Although, since it's not the entire gameplay, I don't mind it as much as I would in 5, but it can tend to break up the wonderful pacing that you experience while playing on the Zenobia as Jill. That's another thing I want to touch on briefly. This game's pacing is all over the place. Since we're jumping around playing multiple characters at different timelines in completely different areas, it leads to a lot of different experiences, and it can end up getting confusing really fast. It takes me out of the overall experience, leading me to getting bored with what's going on pretty quickly, just because I have to swap what I'm focusing on every 15 minutes like I'm watching some Zoomer TikTok. Don't mind me dating myself there. Although to be fair, giving the game credit, it was originally designed for being played in shorter bursts since, let's not forget, it was originally only a 3DS title. The game expects you to only play a little bit here and there, so much so that they've broken up the chapters into episodes. And at the start of each new episode, you get a recap starting with previously on Revelations, which is nice if you play the game the way it's intended, but I tend to play games for at least a couple hours when I sit down. And by doing that, with Revelations, the whole previously thing, it gets old really fast. Revelations doesn't have a lot of talking points for me to go over. I'll admit, I don't end up playing this game too often. I've probably only beaten it twice. There's something about this title that just doesn't really do it for me. Although this game has its cool moments and some really awesome level design, I mean, when it comes to the Zenobia, one of the cooler spots that comes to mind is the massive casino at the back of the ship. That was always fun to fight through. I also find myself getting bored way too often, and I don't really find the game that engaging in a way that I normally would with Resident Evil titles that are similar, like 4 and 5. Like, if we touch on the combat in 4 and 5, everything you attack feels like it has a realistic reaction to what you're doing in real time. But in Revelations, you'll be lucky if you see any of the monsters flinch without dumping at least half a magazine into them. And lore-wise, this probably makes sense, but gameplay-wise, it leaves me wanting more, and it does bring back the dodge feature from Resident Evil 3, but I don't find myself really caring for it as much. It kinda just makes everything too easy to deal with at most times. I don't know. I don't have much to say about Revelations. I feel like it's just best to throw it in C and move on.
Resident Evil.
This brings us to our final game on the list, Revelations 2. A title that takes place during the events of Resident Evil 6, focusing on the characters that were missing from that game, such as Claire and Barry Burton, who we haven't seen since his last appearance all the way back in Resident Evil 3. The main plot follows Claire and a new character, Moira Burton, who've been kidnapped by unknown armed forces, only to later wake up in a secluded prison island. Having no idea where they are, they get contacted by the game's Big Bad, explaining to them that they've been injected with the T-Phobos virus, which mutates people based on extreme emotional distress, and then starts directing our protagonists on what to do to move forward. Little did they know at the time, it's all just a ploy to get our characters to break down and mutate to create the ultimate bioweapon. After being kidnapped, Barry Burton, Moira's father, goes on a one-man mission to do whatever is possible to find his daughter and save both Moira and Claire from this hellhole. Along his adventure, he runs into a little girl named Natalia. While trying to still piece together the clues to find his loved ones, he now must rescue this little girl from all the horrid monstrosities on this island. Does the basic plot to this game sound familiar? It's kinda like if Code Veronica and Resident Evil 4 had a baby. Throughout your adventure, you'll be swapping between controlling Claire and Barry every other episode. That's right, this game is episodic, similar to the same vein as Revelations 1, which means majority of the complaints I had carry over, but not as much because it's a lot more condensed in this title and a little easier to follow. But trust me, that previously on Revelations thing is still very annoying. This game tries to do something interesting with the different playable characters. See, it has a partner system similar to what we had in Resident Evil 5 and 6, however, not quite the same. While playing as Claire, you'll always have Moira with you, but due to traumatic experiences, Moira refuses to use guns, so she's very limited in how she can help out with combat encounters. Moira is primarily a support character, with her flashlight gimmick, acting as a way to highlight items and new pathways while exploring throughout the game. However, she can every once in a while blind enemies during combat, and at a certain point, she'll unlock a crowbar, which can be used to stun enemies and sometimes finish them off if Claire is too busy, while also being a key item to unlock boarded up doors. And while you're playing as Barry, you'll have Natalia with you, who, just like Moira, is more focused on supporting. So throughout Barry's playthrough, Natalia can use her special power to see through walls and point out enemies to Barry to help him with being more stealthy, or just be prepared for combat. In some areas it's even needed, because the game will throw invisible enemies at you, which is such a cool idea, by the way. It can be really fun the first couple of times you interact with it. However, it does get a little old throughout the course of the game, but that's not all Natalia does. The game forces you to split from Barry every once in a while to unlock a door or fetch key items, leaving Natalia defenseless and having to stealth around enemies to get by unharmed, because if you're caught, it's over. GG, restart. These ideas are fun in concept, and the first couple of times that you interact with them, they can be fun. However, the game doesn't really innovate on this partner system much more than this throughout the course of the game, so you'll find yourself repeating the same drawn-out sections over and over again, with nothing really spicing it up that much. Like, stealthing up as Natalia once is fine, but doing it multiple times an episode gets really old really quickly. Especially if you're like me and tend to hate the more run-and-hide playstyles of horror games, due to them not really being scary and just kind of being overall very slow. To avoid too many spoilers, Revelations 2 also falls into the same pitfall that a few other games in the series do, where it tells you a main plot and gives you almost the entire story, but leaves some major things not touched on so that they can later release a DLC for money to explain what we've missed out on. And we talked about it a little bit already, but I find this practice really scummy. And even though the DLC was really good for Revelations 2, I would have much rather that it had just been worked into the base game instead of a DLC. However, I think these days it's included when you purchase the game, so while no longer a problem, it's definitely something I'm not a fan of. Even with the complaints that I lobbied against this game, it still can be very fun at times, and I find myself enjoying it more than I do its predecessor. I feel like there's a solid game here, but it can sometimes get muddied by all of the experimenting that was going on around this time. So, be it the changes to the partner system or the episodic releases, it can end up being a little stale. And with that being said, it may not be the greatest entry in the series, but I appreciate it for attempting to elaborate on the series' characters during the timeline of Resident Evil 6. So I think the entry will go in B. It could be good, but it's got its awkward flaws. Man, that was a roller coaster of emotions. From the series' high to the series' low, we finally find ourselves at the end. It feels refreshing to finally get all of those opinions out in the air. It's not often I find myself able to talk about these games. See, a lot of my viewers don't really play the games themselves, and not many of my friends do either. So I have all of these thoughts and emotions tied to these games, but no one ever to really share them with, except you, dear viewer. But this is it. This is the list. Every Resident Evil mainline game ranked based off my own personal enjoyment. What'd you think? Where would you place these games? I want to hear what you guys have to say. Maybe you absolutely hate Resident Evil 6 and would shove it in the F tier. Or maybe Resident Evil 3 is an absolute masterpiece for you and you just can't get enough. Type down in the comments below and tell me your opinions on the games. Although, do try to keep it respectful. Let's not open the floodgates just yet. I'd love to hear what you guys really feel when you play through these games. But for now, that's going to be it for me. This video has been way too much work, and I'm about ready to knock out on the couch. If you like this video, let me know, and drop a like. If you find yourself coming back, you might as well subscribe at that point. And if you have any other ideas for videos in the future, I'm all ears. But until next time, peace out.